Welcome, everyone. I'm Rachel Stern, Director and CEO of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. We research, discuss, publish, and exhibit artists whose life and work were affected by the German Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945. With this work, we commemorate their lives and achievements. I invite you to become part of our year-end appeal with a donation. The Fritz Ascher Society is a non-for-profit 501c3 organization. Your donation is fully tax deductible. Today, I'm excited to welcome a speaker who many of you already know. Dr. Ori Z Soltes teaches at Georgetown University across a range of disciplines, from art history and theology to philosophy and political history. He's the former director of the B'nai B'rith Klutznik National Jewish Museum and has curated more than 90 exhibitions across the country and overseas. He has authored or edited 25 books and several hundred articles and essays. Recent volumes include Our Sacred Signs, How Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Art Draw from the Same Source, The Ashen Rainbow, Essays on the Arts and the Holocaust, and Tradition and Transformation, 3 Millennia of Jewish Art and Architecture, as well as Growing Up Jewish in India, Synagogues, Ceremonies, and Customs from the Bnei Israel to the Art of Siona Benjamin. Welcome, Ori.
Thank you so much, and it is a pleasure to be here. And it is a pleasure to talk about the art of Samuel Bak, who is approaching his 90th year and with as much ongoing vigor and creativity as he did when he was approaching his 80th, his 70th, his 60th, his 50th, his 40th, his 30th year. In that respect, he hasn't changed. Sam was born in Vilnius in 1933, and that means that when World War II happened in 1939, and not too long thereafter, Lithuania was involved. He had turned 6, which means that 6 for him has always had an important kind of meaning. When one thinks, for example, of the 6-pointed Star of David, for him, it becomes something not just Jewish or something universal in terms of the history of that particular geometric form, but something personal. When he thinks of the 10 Commandments, the 6th is the one that says, thou shalt not commit murder, which is, of course, the commandment that was most obviously and egregiously abrogated in the course of World War II and the Holocaust. In any case, with the opening of the war and the involvement of Vilnius, there was soon a ghetto into which Jews were forcibly moved. And interestingly, in a sense, ironically enough, Sam had his first exhibition at the age of 9 in the ghetto of Vilnius. He and his mother managed to take refuge with the help of Maria Mikulska in a Benedictine convent. They were then removed. They were in a work camp, but they managed to get back out and managed to hide there for the remainder of the war. They were 2 of about 200 from the community who survived out of something between 70 and 80,000, which was the size of the community beforehand. His father didn't survive. He perished. He was shot just a few days before the liberation. It's not clear whether it was by a Lithuanian or by a German. I don't think it matters. The point is he was. And so was most of his family, his 4 grandparents and everybody else. After the war, he and his mom were in the Landsberg displaced persons camp. He took painting lessons in Munich. In 1948, they moved to Israel, the new state. He went to Bezalel. He also served in the army. In 56, he went to Paris to study at the École des Beaux-Arts. And he has been in different parts of Europe and back again in Israel. He was in Rome in 59, first serious exhibitions in Pittsburgh and Tel Aviv in 61 and 63. And to cut to the chase, his originally rather abstract style evolved to become a very unique and unusual figurative style. His work is very personal. It's a personal history. His work is very Jewish. It is the history of Judaism. His work is very Holocaust. It is the story of the Holocaust, all through a very distinctive and distinct kind of iconography. And he brought all of that in full swing when eventually he moved by 1993 to Western Massachusetts, which is where Samuel Bak currently resides. And by then he was very much involved with Pucker Gallery in Boston that has not only mounted countless exhibitions on their premises, they have a new one that just opened about a week ago, but also exhibitions in museums and galleries all over the place. Back in the 90s, when I directed the then and no longer extant B'nai B'rith Kletznik National Jewish Museum, Pucker and Sam and I together put together an exhibition that was at the museum that I directed, and also the same exhibition at the Holocaust Museum in Houston, which now has a whole Samuel Bak gallery, as, for example, the museum, the art museum at the University of Nebraska in Omaha has a whole gallery, a whole museum really devoted to Sam. And the Vilnius Jewish Museum has 2 floors that are devoted to his work. So at this point, he is appropriately all over the world, because what he is doing visually is the sort of thing that individuals like Elie Wiesel or Primo Levi have done verbally, which is to recount something that comes to no end in terms of the recounting, and that it requires a constant recounting and a constant iteration. Samuel Bak is a witness. Samuel Bak is a descriptor of the landscape of Jewish experience. Samuel Bak is a symbolist, and as such a transformer of materials, and as such he's an alchemist. He's a Kabbalist. He's a synthesist, a syncretist, a synthesizer of elements and of questions. He is above all a questioner. And if I may share my screen with you and provide you with this first image, which I am going to grow, although forgive me, that will digitalize it a bit. This is a relatively early figurative work from 1974. It's called The Family. And I think it's self-explanatory in 2 ways. It is an account, maybe 3 ways, of the family, most of whom in the immediate personal sense, of course, as I said earlier, perished. So in that sense, it's memorial to them. But there are figures within this array that are not personal family members, because it is part of his larger sense of the larger family of those who suffered and those who perished. And thirdly, it's an indicator already of the way in which his style is going. So you have very effectively, you might call them almost photorealist sorts of faces, in a manner that is right out of the Italian Renaissance in terms of style. But then you notice, well, wait a second, most of these don't have eyes, as if they're not paintings, but they're sculptures. And then some of them you realize are not even paintings or sculptures, but they're wooden, flat, and other kinds of materials. And then you realize, and actually you've got an easel here, so part of the painting is a painting within the painting, but wait, there's another one there, so that we are seeing layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of what he is doing, both with materials, the transformation, the transmutation, the alchemical change in what was flesh becomes pigment, what was pigment becomes stone, what was stone becomes wood, what was wood becomes flesh. What is a vision is a revision of a vision within a vision. And that's the kind of direction he takes. Here's a work that is also relatively early, and you can see, because it comes with its own label, that it's a self-portrait by Samuel Bak. And I call your attention just to 3 elements here. One, you'll see that there's a little bag in which this child, Sam Bak, sits. And that's because he got out of the ghetto at first because his father had permission to leave the ghetto to gather wood. And so he carried his little son in the bag on his back, in which he brought wood back into the ghetto. And that's how he got out. That's how he hooked up with his mother. That's how in the long run they ended up surviving. And at the same time, you'll notice that there is a kind of fragmentary kind of image that looks familiar. It's a child with his hands raised. And then you realize, wait a second, there's another version of that, as if it's wooden slats, but wait, there's another version behind it. It's another kind of layered series of images and pieces within pieces. We have the real shoes. This is no Darth leaving your red shoes in the desert when you come back home to Kansas from Oz, but it plays on that sort of an idea. Pieces that don't add up and yet add up to a totality. And then we realize there's a whole series that he starts to work on. Most of them are called studies, study I, study G, study H, but they're series of that same kind of familiar figure of a very unhappy looking little boy, which looks very much like the face of Samuel Bak, with his hands held up. And in this case, the hands separated, of course, from the face looking through the window to us. And I remind you that the history of Western art, particularly when we arrive into the Renaissance and its interest in the transmutation of paintings into the illusion that they're not pigment on a flat surface, but flesh and blood volumetric figures and landscapes, that the idea is the illusion that you're looking through a window into space where a landscape flows out, where figures sit, stand, lie, move about, that he's played and punned on that idea because we are looking literally through a window that he is depicted with pigment at a face, which of course is nothing but pigment, but for which we have the illusion of the face. And yet outside the window is that other part that somehow we instinctively recognize relates to, but we can't figure out how exactly it relates to this child, because it's a pair of hands just on pieces of paper that are nailed to this wooden surface so that the nails go through the middle of the palms, and we can't help but think of all those endless images in Western art of the crucified Christ. And then we realize, wait a second, this wooden structure it's cut off, but it's a cruciform. It's a crucifixion. And at the same time, we realize there's another part of it, another geometric part, which gives us a series of diagonals that create not quite, but enough of a reference to a six-pointed star that we can see a cross and a Star of David, so somehow synthesized in the same image, which is dominated, if we look at its colors, by, of course, the browns and the kind of grayish blacks, but the other color is the yellow that almost drips from it, which, of course, we associate with what happened to that six-pointed star in the Nazi context. And then, of course, if we haven't realized, we realize what he's playing on, as Samuel Bak often does, iconic images, whether they are paintings from the German or the Italian Renaissance, or whether they are, in this case, the photograph, the iconic photograph from the Warsaw Ghetto, not the Vilnius, the Warsaw Ghetto, of these impassive Nazi soldiers watching as the Jews marched by, and our focus and their hardly focus is on that terrified child with that beautiful face and those upraised hands, who is on his way to the car that is, of course, going to transport him to Auschwitz. And we realize that's the specific icon that he repeats and repeats and repeats, superimposing ever so delicately his own face on it, creating a kind of dual identity. So here we see another version of this. It's in fact called Identification 1. And we see he's reversed the image, as artists who play on the work of earlier artists will sometimes do, take an idea and reverse its visual. He's done that here. And of course, he's transformed this flesh and blood figure. And so we get the illusion of flesh and blood for the face and hands. And then as we get down to the garment, the sleeves that reach up toward the hands, they become stone, and the whole thing is stuck in stone. And then draped across it, of course, that six-pointed star, which is so familiar to us. And again, we cannot miss the holes in the hands that look, however, not like the kinds of holes that we typically see in the Western history of the image of the crucified Christ, where it's clear that some sort of a spike had been in those hands. These look a lot more like bullet holes, more appropriate to the time and place. Another version, another vision, another reversion, another revision of that same sort of image where the holes now, the hands have become stone. The holes are just peeking through. The figure is back in our direction. The face is now a combination of flesh, and it's not flesh at all. It is cracking stone. It is a sculpture. This transmutation of the different elements accompanies his transformation of the different images. This is a more recent one, and it's simply called Crucifixion. It is the most overt of the images, of which over the years there have agglomerated so many that Bak has done with this same sort of motif, where the figure has actually fallen from the cross, the arms not bloody but torn, and what's left bloody, even though it looks more like paper than by like flesh and blood, hanging from that cross, the shoes off to the side, that dominating yellow element among the other elements, against the background of this vast and flowing landscape that looks like a landscape out of Piero della Francesca. Go back to your art books, look at his portrait, Piero's, of the Duke and Duchess, that is a pear contained in the Uffizi, and you'll see a landscape flowing away from it. Or look at some of the Leonardo landscapes flowing away from the figures in the front. But this is a different landscape, even though it looks like any of those landscapes. It is the landscape of Jewish experience. It's the landscape of Holocaust experience. It is the landscape of which he is the memoirist and the witness. The idea of a crucified Christ within the hands of a Jewish artist, of course, is not something that Sam Bak originated. There are many Jewish artists that have played with that motif, none more famously, of course, than Chagall in his White Crucifixion in particular, that's at the Art Institute of Chicago from 1938, the time of Kristallnacht, where he has transformed his Christ very clearly into not the savior of humankind, but a suffering Jew wrapped in a kind of loincloth that resembles a talit, a Jewish prayer shawl, with all kinds of activities going on around, including hovering above him, not angels, but Jewish elders. We recognize they're Jewish because we see the tefillin box on the forehead of one of them, hovering in horror over what was happening. And the one space on this canvas that is empty is the space around the ladder, where in a standard issue Western Christian depiction, if there is a Christ on the cross with a ladder, the ladder, he has Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus or both of them climbing up gently to lift the body from the cross to create a deposition. But in this image, there is no savior for the savior. There is no redemption for the Redeemer, because this isn't Christ the Redeemer, Christ the Savior for Christianity. This is a suffering Jew who's suffering for his faith. And that's the kind of idea that Bak has transformed so radically in image after image, so that it's very specifically replacing the iconic image of Christ with the iconic image of that boy from the ghetto who also bears his own face, that therefore gives us a whole series of layered senses of imagery. Yet one more. And I show you this one more for one very particular reason, that if again we see the image, which is a combination of flesh and stone and wood and all of this illusionarily through pigment, what we recognize as a dominating element here is a tree broken here, and yet we also recognize that there are branches that are starting to emit greenery. Just at the bottom of this tree, it is broken, but it's not destroyed. There are greens growing up from it. The Torah is the tree of life to them that hold fast to it. The tree of life that the Nazis sought to not just deracinate, but to burn to cinders, and which they failed to accomplish. In fact, you see this child, who himself, anonymous, almost certainly perished at Auschwitz, didn't perish, not just because of an iconic photograph, but because of an endless series of paintings by someone like Samuel Bak, who survived as a child, who commemorates this child, who commemorates the children who didn't survive, 1 million of them incinerated, and those whom he carries forth, who did. And the bottom line, of course, is Star of Yellow David, yellow Star of David on his chest. There's a sense in which he survived, and more importantly, the Jewish people survived, because Samuel Bak's work is personal. It is about himself, but it's not about himself. It's about the Jewish people, the landscapes of Jewish experience. So it's about the Holocaust, but it's not only about the Holocaust, because that happens to constitute a relatively small part of a much longer history of which it is part, and which is really his larger focus, even as at the same time his focus is so narrow and specific. He has a whole range of different kinds of images that, using his very unique visual vocabulary, are part of that landscape. I'm going to grow this one a little bit, hoping that it doesn't get too digitalized for you. It's called Last Movement. It's from 1996, but it's from a whole series of these works in which he has a quartet of musicians playing. You can see a cello, you can see a viola, you can see two violins. And in no one of these do we have a straightforward quartet, of course. Each of the images is slightly different from the others, but what they share in common are, once again, this unique combination in his pigment of the representation of flesh, of stone, of wood, and secondly, in this varied grouping, again, of which this is just one example, elements that are paper, and not only the flotsam and jetsam paper, it's the notes of the music itself that's scattered on the floor around them, but their wings, which are the wings of angels, that have a thin paper, yet somehow wooden and somehow stone kind of quality. And of course, one of the instrumentalists wears a gas mask, and in lieu of the bow, we've got this stick, a piece of a tree, not yet having flourished with notes. And another, of course, is dressed as a soldier, although the soldier's uniform looks much more like World War I than World War II, because it's an eternal music. And now I will be silent for half a second. Did you hear the music of the last movement? The answer is no, you didn't. It was silent. The answer is yes, you did, because the Nazis failed to silence the music. This is in part inspired by a very particular moment, the moment when Olivier Messiaen, the French composer, in a concentration camp, not Jewish, by the way, in a concentration camp, managed to write a quartet which was called Quartet for the End of Time, 8 movements long, and managed to get it performed with what instruments they had at their availability in that concentration camp context. This in part inspired Bach. So it's not just that quartet for the end of time, it is the last movement. It's the final, the end, and yet that's the thing, you see, it's not the end. The music is silenced, and yet it's not silenced. The landscape of Jewish experience is a landscape that he describes in myriad ways, none more eloquent than this repeated series that in different precise ways give us the kind of image you see before you. It's, of course, a 6-pointed star. It's, of course, colored yellow. And we think again of the 6-pointed star as something that emerges in Central Europe in the late 16th, early 17th centuries as a specifically Jewish symbol, having a long history going back into pagan antiquity of simply representing the meeting of two realms, a triangle up, a triangle down, male and female, heaven and earth, used by pagans, by Jews, by Christians, later on by Muslims as a visual element, but arriving at a specifically Jewish connotation in Central Europe by that point, where it comes to be referred to specifically as the Star of David, not to be confused with the Star of Solomon, a 5-pointed star. And in alchemy, both those turns of phrase were used to refer to both those kinds of stars as part of the discussion of alchemical processes of transformation. By the late 16th, early 17th century in Central Europe, it has become Jewish. And by the end of the 19th century, of course, with Jewish nationalism, it has become a more universally considered Jewish symbol. It appears on the first issue of the publication, the Zionist publication that Herzl puts out in 1895 called Die Welt, the world. And of course, the Nazis try and transform it into a badge of shame by pulling out of the vocabulary of medieval Christianity, specifically from the Vatican Council of 1215, where there was a prescription that Jews wear on their garments a marker, and the marker was supposed to be yellow. Yellow came to be associated for them with Judas as a color of betrayal. So the Nazis combined that idea with the idea of the star, and it became a badge intended to be of shame, which reemerges, of course, as a badge of pride in the aftermath of the war and the establishment of the State of Israel, with its talit-like flag dominated by the six-pointed Star of David. This is a Star of David that looks, however, as you can see, like a kind of carved out stone island. If you look at the detail, you realize there are the remnants of houses in the cracks. So it's kind of something that seems to be crumbling. It points in 6 directions, and in every direction, there's nothing but empty sea. In the far distance, there is a shoreline. And this particular painting is called Alone 3. There is a series of alones. So it underscores the isolated aloneness of the Jewish people in the context of the Holocaust. And it alludes, of course, to that passage in the book of Numbers. I think it's chapter 23, verse 9, where Balaam speaks of the Israelites in saying that you will be alone. That's what the Nazis achieve as a consummate fulfillment. That's what Bak has commemorated and transformed. Alone, but ongoing, looking for home. You look at this kind of a painting and you realize you've got sort of the idea of houses, but they're paper, they're not real. And the whole thing is overrun with different kinds of, well, they're Hebrew letters. And we realize that another of Bak's particular obsessions as images are the letters, and the letters that make up words. So we can see, for example, the 3 letters of the word Shema, here, H-E-A-R, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And it's repeated here, Shema, and it's repeated in different places. And then there are places where just the shin by itself seems to be in isolation. And we're reminded that that letter stands for the Hebrew word Shaddai, and Shaddai is one of God's names, but God's name in God's power protective quality. It's the shin that you place on the doorpost of your house, writing it upon your gates in fulfillment of a dictum repeated twice in the Torah, in Exodus and Deuteronomy. To protect your house, you have the shin of Shaddai. And of course, it raises the question, where was that protective aspect of God when 1 million children were being incinerated? It's the theodicy question that has no answer. The answer may be that it's more about where were we as a species rather than where was God. And it is to us, or upon us, upon our shoulders, that the responsibility falls, if not for having been able to fend off what the Nazis were trying to do, to fend off that human quality called forgetfulness, and instead replace it with that other important human quality, memory. Important to humans, particularly important to Jews, it is indeed the very first commandment in the 10 Commandments. Doesn't read that way, does it? It sounds like a statement. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And then we start with these do's and don'ts. But one understands that the implication of that first statement is that it's not a statement, it is a commandment. Remember, Zachor, do not forget that I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And lest we forget, God did a few nasty things to those Egyptians that presumably God didn't have to do. Why did God have to do it? So that we won't forget. We do it every Passover. We commemorate. We dip our fingers into wine, the symbol of joy, and out onto the plate to remember the 10 plagues visited upon the Egyptians. This painting is called Yizkor. It's from 1992, and it gives us the transmutation, of course, of a ship into something of stone, of a sea into something of stone, of houses into something of stone. The only thing that isn't stone besides this dark sky itself is the pair of candles that, of course, rise toward the heavens with their flames and their smoke, remembering, as we do in the course of the week after a loved one has passed away, 30 days later, in what we call Shloshim 30, a year later, and every year and every year and every year and every important festival and celebration, we remember those who perished, who were close to us. And in the context of the Holocaust, we are obligated to remember even those whose names remain unknown to us. And this is another motif with which Bach plays again and again in different ways. This work is simply called Voyage. And here you can see, if the sea has been relegated to being the illusion of the sea, and if the particularities of the stone of the ship are different, and of the houses that some of which collapse as if they're two-dimensional, here too, there's a further transformation and transmutation. The candles have themselves become chimneys, smokestacks, out of which pure smoke rises. And we cannot not think about that iconic image from Holocaust imagery of the chimney, of the smokestack. This then becomes, as it were, a traveling Auschwitz, because after all, there were loads of Auschwitzes. There were 6 official extermination camps and dozens that were not officially extermination camps, but at which many people were exterminated anyway. And of course, we're aware of the fact that many of those who dwelt in the area of a place like Auschwitz afterwards, even there was a guard who wrote a memoir. Those were not human bodies that were being incinerated. Those were the smokestacks of bakeries, the nearby neighbors. Yes, I assumed it was bakeries there, as if one cannot tell the difference between the smell of cooking bread, of baking bread, and the smell of baking human flesh. Anyone who's burned him or herself just a bit knows the difference rather distinctly. So this too is part and parcel of what it is that memory is about. It's not just not forgetting, it's also seeing to it that the truth be told and not be aborted by explanations, which of course are not explanations. Bach is a transmuter of ideas, a transformer of elements. He's alchemist, he's a Kabbalist. He's someone whose focus on letters is not only the focus on letters that make up Shaddai or Shema Yisrael or the 10 Commandments, but within the Kabbalistic tradition, there is the idea that there are 4 different ways of trying to understand Torah. One is to look at it straightforwardly, and that's called pshat. And the Hebrew letter for pshat is, of course, a pei, a p sound. The other is allusive, allegorical, remez. So the letter is resh. The third is to kind of dig beneath the surface. That's what Midrash does. That's what it means. Lidrosh is to dig beneath the surface. And so Dalet is the third. And the fourth is sod, secret, hidden. That's the mystical way. And the 4 letters become an acronym for the Hebrew word pardes, a word evolved, interestingly enough, out of Persian, where paradeshu refers to that exquisitely well-watered garden in the center of an otherwise rather dry environment, reserved for the Shah and people like him. Pardes becomes, in Hebrew, a word that we might translate as orchard or as garden, and it has the implications, on the one hand, of those 4 different ways of understanding Torah by way of the acronym, but as a word in and of itself, it stands for the garden of mystical interpretation. A dangerous process to engage in mysticism. It can blow your mind. It can turn you crazy. It can kill you. It can turn you into an apostate. It's not something you want people to do without the proper discipline, without the proper centering, without the proper training. And so there's a very important little story within the Jewish rabbinic tradition about 4 mucky-muck rabbis who entered the Pardes, and 3 of them were destroyed by it. One died, one went mad, one apostatized, only one, Rabbi Akiva, was solid enough in himself so that he went and returned in peace, in wholeness. So pardes is this rich term that in and of itself implies a mystical process. Within it, 1/4 of it is the mystical process. In being a garden or an orchard, it also has a connection, obviously, back to the Garden of Eden itself as an ideal. And in Bak's hands, like everything else, it's transformed. So pardes is the word that is written, but we're seeing it from the back. So the pei is on the left, not the right, and it's backwards. Pei, resh, dalet, samech, held up against this structure, which we also recognize we're seeing kind of from an odd direction. It's the tablets of the law, it's the Torah, over which hover versions of the tablets in the heaven, this landscape that leads us into the distance. And we realize within these within these two tablets are 4 compartments. 1, 2, 3, 4. That tree that is growing there, that tree of life, to them that hold fast to it, the Torah itself, a more difficult to find, and yet it's there, the tree with remez. Drash digs beneath the surface, and we have to really dig down to see the leaves and what looks like the beginnings of garments beneath which something is going on. When we get to Sod, it's entirely hidden, because that's the realm of hidden. And there the tree assumes what appears to be in part the form of a human, because ultimately you see the arrows point to us. A second in this endless array of different handlings of the idea of pardes by Samuel Bak. Here we're seeing, again, the form of the Decalogue, as it were, opened up. Here we're seeing 4 different compartments, 4 doorways leading into it. There are the letters in wood against stone, Pei, Resh, Dalet, Samech, and now look at the doors, wide open, slightly obscured, slightly more blocked, completely blocked, because it's the hidden way in. And the interior gives us, on the one hand, that flourishing tree coming up through the smoke. On the other hand, a kind of labyrinth till we get to the Torah, symbolized by the 10 Commandments, if we entered here until we get to it there. The maze has become far more complex when we get to Drash, and of course we get to Sod, it's completely hidden. And yet, once again, in that realm, we have a fire that is burning, smoke that is rising, a chimney in the back that cannot fail to connote the Holocaust. And why there? Because nowhere is the answer more hidden than to the question, why? How did this happen? Why did this happen? That question that is first asked in the Bible itself by Job, who suffers, and you and I know, because we're reading the book, so we stand godlike outside him and know that his faith is being tested. He doesn't know that. All he knows is that he was so pious, so holy, and suddenly he's lost his kids, he's lost his cattle, he's lost his fields, he's lost his health, he's lost everything but his life. And when God finally graces him, appearing out of the whirlwind at the end of chapter 37, and in 38 starts to answer Job, what is the answer? The answer is, who the heck are you to ask these questions? Were you there when I started the universe? Were you there when I put the sun, the moon, and the stars in place? Do you know why it rains when it rains, and why it snows when it snows, and where the winds come from? Were you around when I created the behemoth, which is probably a hippopotamus? Were you there when I created the Leviathan? Probably a crocodile. The point is, the answer that God gives to Job is a non-answer answer. It is the answer that there are things that humans are not designed to know. There are questions that we cannot answer. Even as a species, part of what we are about is constantly and incessantly trying to find answers to questions. There is no tradition more obsessed with questions than the Jewish tradition. You don't have any issue that comes up in the course of the Talmud and the Midrash that doesn't have 2, 3, 4, 5 different opinions trying to figure out what it is that you're trying to be doing so that you are living a life, how shall I put it, that God would approve. And yet there is no answer to why those who are completely innocent, surely, let's assume the 5 million adults are not, come up with some reason why every single one of them had some moral failing for which they deserve to die. You can't provide that answer for the million children, because children are by definition, theologically speaking, they're innocent. They're not responsible for their own moral being. So Sod is ultimately where the answer resides, in hiding. It hasn't been exposed. It can't be exposed. And we are obligated to keep asking the question, even though we know we may not come up with the answer. And there is a process of doing this in which we engage that, as it were, does not leave us alone to our own devices. We've come full circle back to that child again in different ways. One looking like a little peasant boy from somewhere in Eastern Europe, the other looking like an angel. Both of them being part of a performance, as it were, before a rough-hewn curtain for which the puppeteer hovers over them with angel wings. This is an angel. And by the way, the little child's angel wings are paper. You may notice there are 6 of them, the kind that you find in the context of Isaiah chapter 6. There's that 6 again, which is to say the seraph kind of angel. They're swirling around the throne of heaven, praising, holy, 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 the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. We praise God even as we question God. We can question God even as we praise God. This child is both a flesh and blood, down here with us kind of creature, and a heavenly angel, both of them in the hands of a larger heavenly angel. A complex series of layers that carry us back through the questions that involve the landscape of Jewish experience, that involve the witnessing of Jewish history, that bring us all the way back to the beginning of the beginning, which for the Jews as a people, comes at Sinai. The decision to embrace those rigorous commandments that are set forth. And of course, within the Jewish tradition, it's not just those 10 that Mo seems to bring down on a pair of tablets from the mountain, but 613 that spread out throughout and fill out the rest of what becomes the Torah. So it is a much more rigorous series of do's and don'ts than just that handful that are popularly referred to, and which Bak here has offered, exploding before our very eyes, because so many of those principles explode in the realm that the Nazis created. And if you look carefully, it's very common, of course, as a kind of synecdoche, where the part stands for the whole, not only to use the 10 commandments, the Decalogue, to represent the Torah, but to use the 10 first letters of the Hebrew alphabet to stand for the 10 commandments. So Aleph is the first, Bet is the second, and we realize where are the letters, and we realize we're seeing this from the back. They're backwards. Here on the left is a backwards Aleph. Then we see a Bet. Then we see a Gimel. Then we see a Dalet. Then we see a Hey. Down here I see the Yud. Here's the Tet. Up here is the Chet. Then there's the Zayin. Where's the Vav? Barely showing. The Vav is the 6th commandment, the thou shalt not commit murder commandment. And often in Bak's work, it's completely missing. All the other letters are there, but not that one. Here, we can find it, but it's sandwiched between these kind of fronts and backs of this extraordinary contrivance, this mountainous everything which is nothing. He is the Kabbalist, he is the synthesist, he is the syncretizer of elements, of questions. And in his syncretism of elements and questions, he also synthesizes different iconic moments, not just that photographic visual that we saw early on, but moments like this. You'll all recognize perhaps that he is quoting that iconic moment at the very center of the Sistine Chapel, created by Michelangelo over a 4-year period between 1508 and 1512 for Pope Julius II to decorate this magnificent chapel. And the center moment is the moment where God is represented as animating Adam. Anima is the Latin word for soul. So it's the central moment where God is besouling Adam, what is expressed in Hebrew as investing this cloud of earth, Adamah, that's why he's called Adam, with Ruach HaChaim, the spirit of life, which we take to mean soul, which we take to encompass all kinds of elements that we associate with the human soul, like free will, like memory, like conscience, like, well, all those other things. And the way Michelangelo chose to do it is that he's got a very muscular, Hercules-like Adam stretched out with a very languid and limp kind of hand, and a very energized, bearded father swooping in a bevy of angels in a kind of cloudish thing with a very agitated and extended, very rigid kind of finger about to touch the finger of Adam. So that's the image that Bak is playing with, except Adam has become a carefully shaved headed individual in rags who bears somewhat of a resemblance, guess whom, to Samuel Bak, behind which we see what looks like the tail end of a missile, of a weapon of destruction. We see the front of one here. We see all kinds of flotsam and jetsam that suggest construction. We see walls that have been devastated. We see those iconic chimneys with the smoke rising from them in the background. Through the rear, we see the bottom part of what we can discern as a kind of cross. Wrapped around it, of course, is a talit. And what is most obvious that we don't see is God. We see the hand of God, but God itself is a carved out empty space, missing. This work is called, actually, Creation of Wartime 3. It's part of a series. So it is both a moment of creation and a moment of a particular kind of human creation, which is war. We are the only species that does what we do to the planet, to other species, and to each other in the manner of killing, in the manner of turning killing into a science and an art, turning torturing into a source of entertainment on the way to killing, expanding that beyond the personal here and now, I torture you in the privacy of my own room, to a vastness that we call war, that reached a whole new level of unprecedented destructiveness in the 20th century. The first part of which was dominated by the Great War, in which new technology like that of gas was put into play that could not only destroy, but damage without fully destroying hundreds of thousands. Of course, by World War II, that's child's play, because now gas is being used to kill civilians and not to kill and maim soldiers. So is it God who is missing? Is theodicy the issue, the question? Is theology the discipline that should be focused on this? Or is it ultimately ourselves? Is it not anthroposociology that really contains the answers to the questions of why we do the things that we do? Early on in his career, one of Bach's favorite symbols, and he did a whole series of these, was pears. Pears that stand in as a symbol of humanity. Lately, he's come back from time to time to that symbol, and of course you see one here. This is a pear with a keyhole. It is the secret, but the secret is locked, and the secret is less about God than about us and what we are as a species. And the answer is lying somewhere in here in the flotsam and jetsam of our own destructive capabilities as we try and figure out what we are and why we are and how we are, assisted in this process brilliantly by Samuel Bak's extraordinary visual art. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Ori. There's so much to digest, such multiple layers of meaning that you revealed and discussed. Thank you so much. We already have a few questions, and please,
Sure.
please, everybody, post your questions. One of them is quite a few questions are statements and not questions. One of the people says shoes as mentions that the shoes that he shows in one of the earlier images you showed refer to the shoes poem of on the Vilnius Ghetto by Avram Zutzek.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Yep, completely correct.
Yes, exactly. And then the same guest is asking, why did you think flesh is turned to stone or wood in his paintings?
Because in the context of what was happening, the treatment of humans made of flesh and blood as if they are not, could be symbolized in that way. And because what is being destroyed at the same time is individuals and who they are, but also the places that we make our places, our homes, which are made of wood and stone. So there's a sense in which we are stand-ins for each other in his rather complex symbolic language.
Mm-hmm.
There's more, but that'll do for now.
So Missy is saying, did you note he was 6 years old during the Holocaust times? Was his family in a camp? His art now speaks everything he might not verbalize or have been able to then. But how can he remember 6 years old history?
So you may not have heard my opening remarks. His entire family perished in the camps. His grandparents all did. His father was still in the ghetto, but he was shot toward the end of the war. So he and his mother were the sole survivors of the family. As for the question of remembrance, well, it's true, as Primo Levi says in the opening lines of his wonderful Drowned and the Saved, his last work, memory is a wonderful but very fallacious instrument that we humans have. So it's by definition flawed. We're not computers. But let me tell you, there are a lot of things that one can remember from one's. I certainly remember things when I was 6 years old, and I can imagine that had I had the kind of traumatic experience that he had as a 6 and a 7 and 8 year old, there's probably a lot of that I would remember, and surely there is a lot of that he does. So it is also, in a way, a transmutation of his memory of, as an adult, of what he witnessed as a child, and placing himself again and again as a child in the visualization of those memories, and the transformation of those memories, or the symbolization of those memories, is just part and parcel of what he does. But I find nothing strange at all that he can recall very well what his experiences were at that point in time.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then Missy also asked whether he had how his training was, whether he had training, and the second part, whether he ever speaks about his experiences to schools, or whether his art is his way of expression.
Right. Again, I did comment very quickly about this at the beginning. I'm not sure what kind of formal training, although I think he had some in Vilnius, even as a kid, because he was, right from the beginning, art was what he wanted to do. But certainly after the war, while he was at Landsberg DP camp, as I said, he went to, actually was the Blocher School in Munich to study art. When he moved to Israel, when it was established as a state, he went to Bezalel, while also serving the army. And then in 1956, he studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. So yes, he had a lot of training. I am not aware, and I don't know whether or not he ever speaks to school groups, but certainly his art is his primary instrument of expressing the stories that he has to tell. as I said toward the outset, he is very much a visual counterpart to people like Elie Wiesel and Primo Levi in the richness with which he recounts what happened and continues to recount what happened and places it in a whole series of larger contexts.
Mm-hmm. Hedy is asking whether you have any insight as to why Bak relocated to the US from Israel. And
yeah,
whether his mother remained in Israel. Did she see his success?
I believe she saw his success, but I'm not certain of this, but I think by 1993, she was no longer alive. By 1993, he was married. And I don't know if that's a factor or whether it was simply that more and more of his art was being shown in the United States through an earlier version of Pucker Gallery. And maybe it just made sense to him. I don't have an absolute answer to why the move to Western Massachusetts, or even for that matter to the United States. I do know that he only relatively recently in the new millennium, I want to say 2001, and I may be misremembering the year, went back to Vilnius for the first time. And of course, he's been there a number of times now. And as I mentioned, at the Jewish Museum in Vilnius, there are 2 floors that are devoted to his work. So there's essentially a Samuel Bak museum in Vilnius, as there are a number of places in the United States where there are permanent substantial collections in Houston and in Omaha and the like. Omaha has a whole study center. So that also goes to the question of his work as not just an exercise in aesthetics or even in commemoration, but an educational instrument. That whole study center is designed to use his work as a means of considering all of these kinds of questions, for which the Holocaust is a particularly intense and, alas, not the only instance with respect to, the larger human questions, what we do to each other and all.
Right. Jana is asking whether you could speak more about the pear image and the locks and keys. At what point in his career was this created, and what is the meaning?
Yes, I can. Give me 1 second because I want to give you the exact year if I can. 1967. He did a series that was called 8 Allegories on a Contemporary Theme. And this was done in Israel, by the way. And the pear was the allegory. The shape of it struck him and strikes him as having a kind of human shape to it. And I think the pear is also one of the fruits that is occasionally associated with the Garden of Eden, right? As opposed to the pomegranate, as opposed to the apple. Sometimes there are those or the orange, there's people who talk about pear. And I think there's that kind of nuance also. So the pear becomes a kind of a symbol of humans, and where the pear becomes, as in this particular image that I showed you, a kind of a carapace that's hiding a secret within it, because the opening in the pear gives us a kind of keyhole. It becomes then a symbol, a particularly strong symbol for humans and the secrets that we have within us, that we ourselves don't necessarily can't answer. Can I always tell you why I did what I did when you asked me? And I can't always. Much less can we as a species answer these kinds of questions. The key itself, separate from the pear, also appears as a symbol very often, because the kind of key that he typically uses has a kind of triple prong to it. And so the triple prong becomes a symbol of the shin, which is the symbol of Shaddai, so the name of God's protective essence. And in fact, in the image that I showed you, there's one key sticking up from the ground, which kind of has that quality to it. So the pear and the key in combination give you a kind of human divine combined question of what's going on, what has happened, can I understand it? It's It's Job, can I ever know? And it's the rabbinic tradition pushing to try to know, and everybody giving their opinions, and even sometimes making fun of each other for their opinions, and so on.
Yeah, of course, there are always different opinions, right? And
yes, exactly.
conflicting.
No, my favorite midrash is when they're talking about, in the beginning God created heavens and the earth, which was created first, and Rabbi A says, well, the order of words, heaven first, earth second. Rabbi B says, well, you need an earth to stand on before you can reach up in heaven. So earth first. Rabbi C says, well, no, it says in Psalms, the heavens are my throne and the earth my footstool. The king makes the throne before the footstool. Rabbi D says, I can't believe you guys are discussing this. Obviously, God made heaven and earth together at the same time, like a pot and its lid. And we're supposed to remember, and that's what's so important about the Midrash, that it's not really about this esoteric question. It's about us, because it says, and we're supposed to remember that most of the time it says Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, but we don't honor Abraham more than Isaac, more than Jacob, because there's such and such a passage where the order is reversed. Usually it says Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, but we don't honor Sarah more than Rebecca, more than Rachel, more than Leah, because there's a passage here where the order is reversed. And then the denouement of the discussion is, and in the 10 Commandments, it says, honor thy father and thy mother. But just because the order is as it is, we shouldn't honor our father more than our mother, because there's that important passage in Deuteronomy where it talks about fearing your mother, and your mother comes before father. That was revolutionary, to think about honoring both parents equally in a world where the mother was just the holding vessel for the father's seed, and the father was the one who was really all about who I am. So those kinds of discussions and questions that cover all kinds of territory are part of the same tradition that has to recognize, by way of Job, that pair with the keyhole without the key in it, with all these mysteries that we can't solve, questions we can't answer, problems we can't solve.
Right. There are so many more questions, but we our time is unfortunately up. I just want to say that Glenn is mentioning that Samuel Bak has written a great memoir called Painted in Words, a memoir, which is a must read. He says, and Jack mentions that Bak is involved in Facing History and Ourselves in Boston, which has a curriculum.
So that answers that question that I couldn't answer effectively. Thank you, Jack.
Yes, and so yeah, Jack says also Kol HaKavod, and Missy says Ori, Toda for your stories, as these explanations made looking at these pieces even more phenomenal. And I want to say the same. Thank you so much for your enlightening lecture. I've learned a lot, and I think we'll all go back to Bak's images and see them with different eyes. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All the best to everyone. Thank you.
Bye.